All right, thanks, Mike. This next topic, grid operations in PJM, this is somewhat of a repeat from the summer conference where we had a breakout session, and it's also a topic we get into with new employees and new trustees. You know, we sort of tend to not think about how the grid operates and all the activities that are involved in making sure our generators get scheduled and we make accommodations for our load. So our next speakers will cover that information. Hopefully you find it interesting. So this is going to be Kevin Zemanek and Kara Smith. Kevin joined Buckeye and OEC back in 2004, the same year I did. Kevin has his hands in a lot of activities across the organization. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree from the University of Dayton. Kara joined Buckeye and OEC back in 2013, and like Kevin, she has her hands in a lot of activities across the organization, not just in grid operations. She has a bachelor's degree from Ashland and a master's degree from University of Dayton, and so I think you'll find this interesting. So welcome, Kevin and Kara.
All right, is this on? All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us back again. We had the breakout session in August, and it's a privilege to be back here. We know a number of you are probably experts from sitting in on that session in August, so we've added a few more materials. Didn't expect to have a winter storm in December that we could add to this presentation, but we are going to hit on that. And so we've got three kind of main sections to the presentation that we're going to go through. Feel free to ask questions at any time. Doug told me that there's a timer in the back, but we're allowed to let it go negative. So I'm not going to pay attention to that. So ask questions at any time. We'll pause in between the three segments as well. And so we'll start off at, again, a really high level of what is the grid. So when we talk about this, the electric grid or the power grid is used to describe the system or equipment required to get electric power from the generating source all the way to the consumers. So it seems pretty simple. And if we look at this next slide, kind of a one-line diagram, it is pretty simple at this scale. So starting in the upper left, we've got generation, some sort of power station, create electricity, steps up to high voltage, goes across the transmission system, ultimately closer to where the consumers are through a distribution substation and then where it's going to be used. So if you think about Buckeye, we're the generation and transmission cooperative. So we're the A and B on this chart. We own the generation or we make arrangements to get generation and the transmission necessary to get that to each of your guys' distribution co-ops, where then we hand it off to you, you take it, and get it to the ultimate end-use consumers. So it seems pretty simple at this level. If we look at this next graphic, a little bit more going on. So Mike just said in his presentation, there's about 1.1 million megawatts of generation in North America. All these dots represent a different power station. They're color-coded by resource type, and the size of it represents how large or small the resource is. So you can see there's a lot of generation through the U.S., different mixes throughout. Again, 1.1 million megawatt hours, and to put that on scale, Buckeye has about 2,500 megawatts. So we have a fair amount. We can serve all you guys, over 400,000 meters in Ohio, but a fairly small piece when we look at the total grid. And so we have all these generating stations all throughout the U.S. How does that actually get to the people that need it? So we have a high voltage transmission system, and on this map it's showing everything over 230,000 volts. And we have about 250,000 miles of high voltage transmission around the country. So again, just a really large number, a lot of systems and equipment in place to get power from where it's generated to where it's ultimately consumed. And you can kind of see it's split out into three segments here: the Western interconnection, the Eastern interconnection, and then, of course, Texas by itself. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation and when we talk about the winter storm that happened. But for the most part, we're all connected to each other, and we're not an island by ourselves. And so again, high voltage transmission is everything over 69,000 volts. It's thought of as the interstate highway for the electric grid. So you're transmitting a large volume of power over long distances. You use high voltage because you ultimately have less losses over those distances. Once it gets closer to the end-use consumers, we hand it off again to the distribution, which is 69,000 volts or lower. And then it is ultimately, goes to a home where somebody can plug stuff in, switch a light on, or to large manufacturing and industrial customers. So something that, maybe a lot of people don't think of and there's no reason to think of, is all these things are going on and it has to stay in balance all the time. You can't have more generation than there is load. You can't have more load than there is generation. And there's some small fluctuations that you can have in that, but in general, it always has to be balanced. And so on one side of the scale, you have demand and the losses that are going through the transmission system. And then on the other side of the scale, you have the amount of generation, or what they call on this chart, interchange. And that's how much you can either import or export from your neighbors. So again, I showed that map. The whole eastern part of the United States is connected to each other. And so there is power transfer between pretty much everybody in that footprint. So since everything has to stay in balance at all times, there's naturally something called a balancing authority. These balancing authorities ensure in real time that the power system demand and supply are finely balanced. The balance is needed to maintain the safe, reliable operation of the power grid. And so if we look at this for North America, you can see the highlighted sections. There's a number of balancing authorities throughout the US. The one we're really focusing on today, because it covers Ohio, is PJM. And so that's kind of in that purple color that Kara's going to give us a lot more information on. But there are a lot of balancing authorities connected, and they share responsibilities to try to help maintain each other's grids as well under certain circumstances. So what happens when things aren't in balance? So if it's a short time period and a short deviation from being in balance, the balancing authorities can usually handle that and manage it. So they can either dispatch additional generation that's not already online. So if we think of our Moan and Greenville plants, the gas plants have very quick response times. So if they're not online, but PJM needs them on, Greenville can be, from the time they call us to the time we're online and at base load, is right around 10 minutes. So very quick response time. Moan is larger units, so it takes a little bit longer time, but it's about 15 to 20 minutes. And so if there's short time periods or short megawatt deviations, short imbalances, they can call extra generation online. The only other option, if you think of that scale, is to reduce load. So they could call voluntary load control or load management. Now, if that scale gets longer in time or higher in volume, things start to there's a lot of issues that can happen. So the grid can become unstable. Generators can trip off because there's a number of protection systems built in to prevent them from being damaged under certain circumstances. There's special types of relays out there that will automatically shed load if needed. So if the demand is too high, not enough supply, then those relays will open up and turn people's power off. Ultimately, the thing we never want to have happen, and it's a pretty rare thing, but it has happened, is you have a full-scale blackout. And so 2003, we had the northeast blackout, which is what this graphic's showing. A large portion of the eastern part of the United States was black for a number of days. A couple years ago in Texas, got really close to the same thing. So a lot of imbalance. They made quick enough decisions to shut people's power off before it became a cascading event, or else they would have had this similar outcome. So I will take a quick pause there. That's like high-level grid operations, what's involved between generation, transmission, and how to balance that. So again, happy to take any questions at this stage or as we move on. All right, everybody's being shy.
You got one?
Yes. Possibly. And so this was just before my time as well. So Buckeye joined
Kevin,
PJ.
Kevin, can you repeat the question so
Yeah,
everybody
sorry.
knows what the question was?
So the question was, in 2003, this graphic shows a lot of the area that didn't have power was in PJM's footprint. And so that is true. So when Buckeye joined in 2004, so PJM used to be a much smaller footprint. They expanded west in 2004 and then a few years after that as well. So we were not part of PJM at that point. This issue happened, I believe, up in First Energy due to some SCADA equipment and not realizing what was going on quick enough. And by the time they realized cascading had already happened, and they opened things up, I think as quick as possible to say from the, it's cascading further. So we were not impacted by this. I remember, so I was just finishing my schooling at UD. I remember the pictures of people walking out of New York City. No one had any power. There was no way to get out of the city with traffic jams that everybody just had to walk out. So luckily we were not impacted by that. And luckily in Texas as well that it didn't have a full-scale blackout. Once you have those, it's not like you're flipping things back on instantly to get it back. It's multiple days to get the transmission lines re-energized, and then you have to bring one thing on at a time. So usually the first thing that they do is try to preserve the nuke plants and the high voltage systems and allow the nuke plants to shut down safely or to be able to maintain the power to keep them on. Good question. Anybody else before we go on to the next section? All right. So I will turn it over to Kara. So we did high-level grid operations, and then she's going to go into kind of how PJM plays in that.
All right, so PJM is the largest regional transmission organization in the world. Their footprint covers 13 states, and they have 65 million people. So Kevin talked about what a balancing authority does. Well, PJM is our region's balancing authority. Their job is to make sure load stays in balance with generation. And they do this by operating a competitive wholesale electricity market, which we're going to talk about. They also manage the high voltage electricity grid. So it's important to note here that PJM does not own transmission or generation assets. They simply direct the operation of them. Okay, here's a graphic of PJM. It's broken out by transmission zone. So you can see in Ohio, we have 4 zones. We have load in all 4. They are First Energy, or ATSI, AEP, Dayton Power and Light, or AES, and Duke, Ohio. But you can see there's many of them throughout the footprint. So how does PJM balance this? Well, they work with generation and transmission owners. They have 24/7 monitoring of system conditions, and they do this through 3 fully redundant control centers. So if one of them goes down, they can easily operate out of their backups. They're constantly monitoring what-if scenarios, also called contingency analysis. They want to stop problems before they happen. So for an example, if they're looking at this and they say, what if line X trips? Well, when they're doing this analysis, if line X trips, which trips line Y, which trips a generator, that's not good news. So they can reconfigure the system to avoid this happening even before that first line ever trips. They also have to maintain enough generation reserves. So generation reserves are generation that is available to operate but is not currently online or producing megawatts. So there's 2 kinds. One is a generation plant that is offline but can easily come online if needed. So we talked about our Moan and Greenville plants. They're quick start plants. So if PJM needs them, we can start up. Now our Cardinal plant is not as quickly to start up. But if Cardinal is online but not at their max load, they have reserves that they can easily increase in load if PJM needs those. And these are important because if a large unit trips offline, let's say a 1,000 megawatt unit trips offline, well, 1,000 megawatts of load is still being there and still needs to be served. So you have that imbalance. So PJM needs to be able to call immediately an extra 1,000 megawatts of generation to make up for that loss. PJM also is in charge of implementing and enforcing the rules for market participation. So PJM has roughly 1,000 members. Each one of these members has to abide by a 5,000-page tariff, numerous operating agreements, and manuals. So this is kind of a process in and of itself to follow all these rules that's needed for this market. Here's a picture of the main control center. This is just outside Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. So PJM staffs their control centers 24/7. Multiple people, multiple roles are always being filled. You can see they have views of everything going on. So they can see the output of every generator on the system. They're able to see any transmission constraints that may occur. All right, so I said PJM operates a competitive wholesale electricity market, but what does that actually mean? So there's 3 types of markets. There's the energy market, which is short term. They're looking at today and tomorrow. How can we cover demand today and tomorrow? There's the capacity market, which is a longer term market. It looks out 3 years into the future. And then finally, there's something called an ancillary services market. I'm not really going to touch on that one, but it's kind of like the other market. So other services that are needed for the grid. Things like reactive power, black start units, those reserves that I talked about earlier. So other services that are needed. All right, so I'm going to go through energy and capacity markets here. We're going to start with the energy market. All right, so this is a chart of one day. So you have hours going across your x-axis at the bottom, and you have megawatts of load on the y-axis. So your black line is the PJM load forecast for the day. So PJM has their own internal forecasting tools, so they kind of know how much to expect. Well, we know that we need enough generation to meet that demand. So we need to figure out how we're going to serve that. PJM gathers offers from every unit in the system. Each unit tells PJM, hey, I'll give you energy for $10 a megawatt or $50 a megawatt. PJM takes all those offers and they start stacking them, least cost to most cost. So that's kind of the rainbow that you see there. Now the unit types that are labeled, This is a PJM graphic. This is just in general which ones are cheaper and more expensive. It's not always right. So you can kind of ignore those. That's just a generality. But so let's look at hour ending 5. That's the dip there. You can see load looks like it's about, we'll say 87,000 megawatts. Lowest part of the day. We can serve that load with $15 resources. We don't need anything more expensive. But if you look toward hour like 16, the peak of the day, that's up above 130,000 megawatts. All of a sudden, your $15 resources aren't enough to cover that. In fact, they have to go all the way up to $120 resources. So, if $120 resources are online serving load, that's the price of energy for that hour. And in fact, every unit that is online is getting paid that $120. Even if your offer was $10, you're going to get paid $120 because PJM needs the $120. All right, so that energy price is called LMP. It stands for locational marginal price. This is the pricing method that PJM uses to talk about what the price of energy is on the system. Load pays the LMP, generators get paid the LMP. Now, similar to what we just showed on the previous slide, higher LMPs indicate they need more generation. So during the peak load of the day, where the load was higher, we need more generation to cover that load. LMPs are different by location. So there are over 8,000 nodes in PJM. So the LMP reflects the needs of the system. And the needs of the system are different everywhere in PJM. Finally, the LMP is calculated for both the day-ahead and the real-time market, which I'm going to cover in a second. All right, first, we just want to show what LMPs could look like. So this is a contour map of PJM. Now, the purple area represents negative LMPs. So if you're in that purple area, you're paying PJM to put megawatts onto the system. However, if you're in that yellow area, that represents a high LMP. So what does this tell us? Well, PJM needs less generation in the purple area, and they need more generation in the yellow. Well, that doesn't really make sense, right? They're right next to each other. So there is something else going on here. There is a transmission constraint that is not allowing the megawatts to flow where we need them. So there's too many megawatts in that purple area, and they can't travel to the yellow area. All right, so I said day-ahead market. The day-ahead market is essentially a forecast of what's going to happen tomorrow. So every day by 11 a.m., every market participant has to submit to PJM its load forecast and its generation offers and parameters. PJM compiles all this information, and they clear the market, we say, for the next day. So similar to what we showed, they have the load forecast, they stack up their resources, and they determine what generation they're going to need for the next day. This is done hourly. So for 1 hour, they have one load value and one generation value. Now, that's not going to happen, right? So we get in real time, we have the real-time market. So this is based on what's actually happening on the system. So here we have LMPs that are calculated every 5 minutes. This is because the system is changing constantly. Generators are getting dispatched every 5 minutes. We need to reflect what's going on every 5 minutes. The real-time market can be extremely volatile. The day-ahead market, you can kind of say, well, load is higher, my LMPs are going to be higher. In the real time, that's not necessarily true. You don't know what's going on. For example, let's say a 1,000 megawatt generator trips off the system. all of a sudden PJM is in need of an extra 1,000 megawatts. That LMP might spike to incentivize generators to increase in load. Now that might happen at 2 a.m. when you're least expecting it. You can't predict that. So that's why we say the real-time market is volatile. All right, so now we're going to talk about the capacity market. The capacity market looks out 3 years into the future. So we're talking about peak load now. So last year, our peak load was about 150,000 megawatts in PJM. Now, if PJM just procured 150,000 megawatts, they wouldn't be able to serve that load because undoubtedly, some of it's not going to be there. It's going to be unavailable. So they actually procured 180,000 megawatts of capacity for this year. These capacity resources are paid to be available when needed. So you do not need to be running in order to receive this capacity payment. You do have requirements, though, which are on the next slide. But if you're getting paid just to be available, someone's got to pay for that, and that's load. So PJM has a method they've decided on to determine how to allocate the cost for capacity. This is called the PJM 5CP, which stands for 5 coincident peaks. So they take the 5 peak hours of the summer, and they say whatever your load was as a percentage of PJM's, that's your share. So if Buckeye's load was 1% of PJM's load during those 5 hours, we're going to pay 1% of all the capacity charges in the RTO. Now, I'm just going to do a little side off on load control here. One of the reasons we do load control is to lower our capacity payments. If we can lower our load during those 5 hours, maybe we'll only be 0.95% of PJM's load, and that will lower our capacity charges to our members. That's just one of the reasons we do load control. All right, so you're getting paid just to be available. You don't even need to run, kind of, right? There are requirements. You have a must-offer requirement into the energy market. If you are a capacity resource and you're a traditional resource, you have to tell PJM every day, I will generate for you at X dollars. And if PJM is willing to pay X dollars, you better be online when they call for you. Now, other resources like demand response and intermittence don't quite have that same requirement. But there is also a requirement to be on during any PJM emergency. So, if you are not online during a PJM emergency, you will incur a very large penalty. And there are no excuses for not being online. So the penalty rate for this year is about $3,000 a megawatt hour. So let's put that into perspective. Today, normal day, I'd say the price of energy is about $40 a megawatt. So if you're generating, you're getting paid $40 a megawatt to produce. If there's an emergency and you're not there, you're paying them $3,000 a megawatt. And that's just per megawatt. So if we take a cardinal unit, if a cardinal unit is offline during an emergency, that's a penalty of about $2 million per hour. All right, so that is going to kind of lead us into our third section, what happens in PJM when the grid isn't balanced. And we're going to talk about those emergency operations. So let's pause. I just threw a lot of information. Energy market and capacity market are really complicated. Who has questions?
It seems like there's a level of, they're trying to provide a marketplace, but the intermittency of the renewables, is that factored in, or are they getting preferential treatment? And does that really kind of skew all these results in trying to balance a grid? So that's the question.
You nailed it. So traditional resources have a lot stricter requirements than the intermittence and demand response do especially during some of these emergencies and what's considered to be capacity. It's been brought up a number of times. It just hasn't gotten through the stakeholder process or through FERC. PJM is currently reevaluating the capacity market as we speak. And it will be brought up again and trying to have a fair, I guess, representation, a fair requirement for everyone. So if you're going to be a capacity resource, you should be able to provide X, Y, Z, and that's what PJM and a number of the stakeholders are going through right now, is to define that product and what we need during these emergencies. Good question. Yes.
A couple years ago, Greenville couldn't go online because if they would have gone online, it'd have sucked Dayton dry and they wouldn't have had any home heating. Now, what do you do with a problem like that?
So we're going to talk about that during this winter storm event in the whole next section. And so what you're bringing up is, and Mike Kaiser had in his presentation, it's very difficult to build resources. The only thing that has been built over the last 10 or 15 years outside of wind and solar has been natural gas plants. The pipeline infrastructure hasn't followed, and so you get preferential treatment typically to the home heating. And what we saw during this winter storm were power plants were forced offline, even with what they called firm gas and firm gas transportation, were still shut offline by the gas pipeline in favor of the home heating. And so we had that issue a number of years ago. More gas plants have been built, not as much gas infrastructure. And if more gas plants are built over the next few years, it's just going to become an even bigger problem. So one thing we have done to hedge ourselves during these events is we have backup fuel oil at Greenville and Moan. So if we get into that circumstance where we can't get gas, we do have some diesel fuel oil that we have the ability to run, and we would have had enough to cover this last PJM event. Great question. Yes.
I guess that was kind of my similar question, is can they be penalized? You were talking about the fines, if it's out of their control, if they can't get the gas they need or it's frozen up, do they still get penalized if they have no control over that?
They are absolutely going to be penalized. Those companies are, in our estimation, are going to go to FERC and complain and say they did everything they could to have firm gas transportation. They bought gas and it was still cut. But the current market rules are they will be penalized at that $3,000 a megawatt hour rate.
Kevin, we have one over here.
I'm curious as to what the security levels are at the 3 PJM control points, because it seems like it needs to be greater than that some of our military positions.
They're pretty secure. So Kara and I have done a tour of their main office, and you have to provide them a number of documents before you can go in there. It's clearly it's armed, a lot of security. You can't get into the parking lots. And then that one is some amount underground. You go on an elevator and you're not sure exactly how far down, but and then they have 2 other locations. The third one came out of COVID. They used to only have 2, and they wanted to keep everybody separate. And so they created a third control room and plan to just maintain that now going into the future. Great questions.
All right. So I keep talking about PJM emergency operations, but what exactly is that? So PJM has a series of escalating alerts, warnings, and actions they can issue depending upon the severity of the systems of the system. So We have variable levels, and you've probably heard of some of these. So they have what's called a load management action. So if they need more generation, their other option is to decrease the load. So they have resources that sign up to do this, that they'll decrease the load under emergency operations. They also have something called a max gen event, which basically means be online at your absolute max. And you better be online at your absolute max. And these alerts, warnings, and actions keep increasing in severity until finally you reach the last one, which is manual load dump. Now that means that PJM has done absolutely everything they can to maintain the system, and they cannot do it anymore. So they will start to manually shed load because they don't have enough generation. What's your only option? Decrease the load. So these alerts are really useful. Based on which alert PJM issues, PJM members know what's going on in the system. So each alert comes with a list of requirements for member owners, and they also have a list of requirements for PJM. So you know what your requirements are, you know what PJM's requirements are. All right, so we're going to talk about Winter Storm Elliott. What made Winter Storm Elliott special? Because we've had cold weather before, and we don't always start talking about the grid being unreliable. So 3 things went into this winter storm. The first is that the temperature dropped almost 30 degrees in a 12-hour period. That's pretty drastic temperature change, and it doesn't normally happen that fast. The second thing was PJM's load forecast was off by 10%. So PJM has had cold weather, and PJM has had Christmases. PJM has not had cold weather on Christmases. So what they did was they looked at the coldest Christmases they had, and they used that to forecast. Well, those Christmases were not cold enough, and they under forecasted by 14,000 megawatts. Finally, they had an outage rate of over 20%. So all of those capacity resources that we pay to be available, 20% of them were not available. So just a graphic of those 2 days, December 23rd and the 24th. We've got PJM's load forecast from the night before on the blue line and what actually happened on the red line. So you can see for the first 12 hours of this chart, they're pretty close. And then right around, we'll say noon on the 23rd, actuals just started taking off. And PJM wasn't prepared. They had enough generation for their load forecast. And all of a sudden, they're scrambling to get more generation for this extra load that they have. For some perspective, a normal load forecasting error is about 3%. So to be 10% off is not good. All right, so at this point, I'm going to turn it over for Kevin, and he's going to talk about the generators.
All right, so while they're under forecast, they're trying to bring more and more generators online to meet that demand. They're also having unit after unit trip off at the exact same time due to mostly fuel or cold weather related issues. So this chart shows the total outages at the peak were just over 23%. That is an extremely high number of power plants that tripped off in a day and a half. So 46,000 megawatts of generation out of their roughly 180,000 were offline. And as you can see on this chart, a large portion of that is natural gas. And Warren, part of that goes back to your question is the pipelines couldn't support them running. Going back to this slide where Kara said they under forecast. So something with the gas market, you have to tell them 5 to 7 hours ahead of time before you come online, buy your gas and get it on the pipe before you start up. If PJM under forecast by 14,000 megawatts, they're not telling those generators they need to be online 5 or 7 hours ahead of time. They're calling them when it's too late, and those gas power plants can't get the gas they need to actually run. So the load forecast kind of factors into this chart as well. Similar with the coal being at 7,500 megawatts, a lot of that was long lead time. So Kara mentioned, our gas plants can start in 10 to 20 minutes. Our coal plants might be 10 to 20 hours. So if PJM didn't forecast 20 hours ahead of time that they needed that plant online, it's not going to be available when they need it, and that's why it's showing up in this purple color here. So one thing that kind of stood out to me during all the PJM meetings, and I think it caught maybe some other people off guard that it probably shouldn't have, is some of the other issues with energy-dependent resources. So Mike Kaiser talked about lithium ion. There are definitely some good cases for it. So one downside that we all realized over December 23rd and 24th, along with pumped hydro, is if the loads are so high overnight, there's not enough electricity to charge those batteries overnight or to allow the pumps at the pumped hydro to replenish the reservoirs, and PJM did not let them run. So they had about 5,000 megawatts of pumped hydro that they did not let recharge overnight, the 23rd going into the 24th, because they did not have enough electricity to power those pumps. Something that had never kind of popped out in my head, you think you're always able to charge these batteries or hydro whenever you want, but in this case, it just wasn't even available as an option. So that 5,000 megawatts really hindered the morning of December 24th, where if they had that electricity, it would have been a much different story. So something else we just wanted to show as a reference as well as we're talking about different resources. We have our Solar 1 and our Solar 2 output on here versus PJM's load in the black line. And so it did its normal profile where it produced electricity during the middle of the day, but just wanted to show how's that line up when PJM actually needs it. And so PJM had 23 hours of emergencies over that 2-day period. You can see the evening of the 23rd, it started at 4:30 p.m. and maybe we had about a half hour of a little bit of output from solar. The rest of the evening, there was no benefit. Same thing in the morning, it started at 4:30 and then lasted till 10 p.m. Had some output during the day, but you also notice it lines up with the lowest loads PJM had for the day as well. So it did produce, but it doesn't really line up, especially in the winter when PJM has emergencies. So we don't have any wind data to be able to show. So it was extremely windy, this event. I'll say compared to normal output, wind production was higher than what they were expecting for that time period. So that was a positive in this event. And kind of going back to the whole intermittency, if you look back at what happened in Texas, it was the complete opposite story. There was no wind. Talking to some of our fellow G&Ts out west that have over 1,200 megawatts of wind, they said they got 17 megawatts out during Winter Storm Uri. So 17 out of 1,200 is just, it doesn't help you at all. There's some value in these resources, but with them being intermittent, not being able to dispatch them when you need them makes it a lot harder during emergencies. And so Kara talked about price signals. Starting at the bottom with the blue line, PJM did their day-ahead forecast. They thought they had enough generation to meet that. You can see the prices are much lower, fairly stable through the whole time period. The red line is what happened in real time. So clearly you can see PJM was not ready for what was going to happen. Their market reflects that. And so we had multiple hours above, I'll say $2,000 to $4,000 per megawatt hour. This is in addition to the capacity penalty Kara was talking about. That's $3,000 per megawatt hour. So if you were offline during this event, you got hit with these high prices plus the $3,000 per megawatt hour for capacity. It was a very stressed situation for PJM and all of its neighbors during those 2 days. So just wanting to kind of wrap this up, we've talked through a number of high-level how the grid works, how PJM tries to manage it, and what happens when it doesn't. And so just to kind of keep in mind that supply and demand always have to equal each other. Everyone, especially in the Eastern interconnection, are connected to each other. We're not an island. Reliability is needed for the entire area. So if our plants are running and no one else is, that doesn't help us. Our electricity doesn't go from our power plants to our members. And so PJM, again, has numerous tools to try to help with this. I think what this past winter showed that they need some modifications. It got really close to failing in December when the loads were high, but not as high as they've seen in the past. And so while we got through this in PJM and in Ohio, TVA, Duke, LG&E, and KU all had rolling blackouts during this time period. So I'll say we kind of got lucky through this. It's like we've heard from multiple presenters, it's not going to get better in the near term. It's something us as Buckeye and other companies are trying to figure out and try to prevent in the future. But like everything at PJM, it's a large stakeholder process. It's very bureaucratic, and you get people on all sides. So that is all we had for kind of the high-level grid operations and what happens when it doesn't work. Any last questions from anyone? I think we've got a mic coming to you.
Hello. This is a question probably for Kara, since she's a mathematician. But during that 2-day event, if Cardinal would not have been able to operate, what would those penalties have amounted to, and did we have enough insurance to cover that?
Sure. So I said one Cardinal unit offline was about $2 million an hour. So doing this math on the fly. So 2 Cardinal units, $4 million an hour times, do you know how many hours we had?
23 hours.
23 hours?
So about 100 million.
He's much better at mental math than me. I'm used to having a calculator. You said 23 million?
100 million.
100 million? Okay.
So it'd be 100 million on the capacity issue. We have an $80 million policy. Mm-hmm. So it would, depending on the issue, so one thing, a lot of other companies have insurance as well, but they do not cover fuel supply issues. So typically the nice benefit of Cardinal is you've got 30 days of coal on site, so that's not usually why you're tripping off. We have a $5 million deductible, so we would pay that. We would go for $80 million in claims, and we would have a little bit more to get to that penalty. So yeah, it puts it in perspective. $100 million for a 23-hour event is unreasonable and something we're trying to fight to change.
Due to the society we live in, will there be a lot of lawsuits, or will there be some companies that'll literally go broke?
Yeah, great question. Under the existing PJM rules, these generators would have 3 months to pay, and the estimated penalties are between $1 and $2 billion for that 23-hour event. PJM thought it was very likely that a number of these generators would default and have filed, I'll say, an emergency waiver with FERC to try to get an extra 6 months added to the payment, I'll say the payment plan. So that sounds good. One concern is there's another event that happens in between now and that 9 months, and those generators are gone. But as we see, PJM is already close and on the brink of not having enough generation. If these generators default and they kick them out of the market, it just makes it worse. So PJM is trying to minimize defaults as much as possible.
Where does the money go for, like when PJM takes these fines, who
Yep.
gets it?
Great question.
Yeah, so some generators were not there. They did not perform. We saw 20% outages, but somebody did pick up the slack. So all those penalties go into this bonus pool of money, and all the generators that overperformed are going to get their share of that.
So we had very good generator performance, Cardinal, Moan, and Greenville, and are expecting a big chunk of that overperformance representative to our size. So we should come out of this with the good performance of our resources coming out net benefit overall, but that still doesn't make it, in our minds, seem right. Generators shouldn't be going broke after a one-day event. Glenn? Okay.
You've talked a lot about blackouts, but you haven't mentioned anything about voltage reduction and how that fits into the picture. Would you care to comment about that a little bit?
Do you want me? So that is one of the actions that PJM can do is voltage reduction. They called a voltage reduction warning on the morning of the 24th. They didn't go all the way to action, but they kind of went part way where they told all power plants to cut non-essential load as much as possible. The next step would have been a voltage reduction where they asked for maybe 5% voltage reduction on the transmission system to reduce the load. So they have that one, and then after that, it's shutting people off. Great question. All right. Anything else? Thank you again for having us.
Yes, thank you.